James Carter wasn't the kind of man people noticed. At 47, he moved through his days like a shadow, quiet, steady, and always in the background. Every morning before sunrise, he laced up his worn work boots, tucked a thermos of black coffee into his faded lunch pail, and walked the 10 blocks to the Manhattan Conservatory of Music. The building loomed like a cathedral of sound, grand marble steps, tall arched windows, and the constant hum of violins, cellos, and pianos drifting through its halls. But James didn't come to play. He came to clean. For the past 12 years, he'd been the night custodian, though lately he'd switched to days to spend more time with his daughter. His job was simple: sweep the practice rooms, empty the trash, wipe down the grand pianos after students finished their lessons, and make sure the floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers. He never complained. He liked the rhythm of it, the quiet afternoons, the echo of distant scales, the way dust motes danced in sunbeams slicing through high windows. It was peaceful, and in that peace something unexpected had taken root. No one knew it, but James had been listening. Not just hearing, but truly listening. While mopping outside practice room 3, he'd catch a student fumbling through Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and by the next week, he could hum the whole thing. When a graduate student rehearsed Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor late into the evening, James would stand just outside the door, broom in hand, eyes closed, absorbing every swell and crash like it was a prayer. He didn't understand music theory. He couldn't read sheet music, but his ears were sharp and his heart was wide open. At home, in the basement of a modest brick apartment building in Queens, sat his secret, a second-hand upright piano he'd bought for $150 from a church rummage sale 20 years ago. Its keys were yellowed, one pedal squeaked, and the middle C was slightly out of tune. But to James it was a treasure. Night after night, after his daughter was asleep and the city had quieted to a low hum, he'd sit at that piano and play, not from memory in the traditional sense, but from feeling. He'd replay melodies he'd overheard at the conservatory, twist them, reshape them, add his own sorrow, his own joy, his own story. He'd never had a lesson. His mother, long gone now, had played hymns on a similar piano in their tiny living room when he was a boy. He remembered sitting on the floor, watching her hands move like birds over the keys, the way the music filled the room like warm light. After she passed, the piano stayed silent for years, until one lonely night when James, then in his 20s and working odd jobs, sat down and tried to find that same light again. It took months just to play a simple scale without stumbling, but he kept at it, alone, patient, persistent. Now, 2 decades later, his fingers knew things his mind couldn't explain. He could mimic the rolling thunder of a Chopin etude or the gentle ache of a Debussy prelude. Not perfectly, not like the conservatory kids with their perfect posture and metronomes, but with a kind of raw honesty that made even the old piano sigh in gratitude. Still, he never imagined anyone would hear him. He played for himself, for his daughter, and sometimes for the stray cat that liked to sit on the fire escape outside his window. Music was his private language, his sanctuary, until the flyer appeared. It was taped to the staff bulletin board near the custodial closet, bright yellow paper, bold black letters. Hidden Talent Showcase. Open audition. All conservatory staff and community members welcome. Below it in smaller print. Share your gift. No experience necessary, just heart. James stared at it for a long time. His heart thudded in his chest. He almost walked away. What was he thinking? He was a janitor, not a performer, not a musician in anyone's eyes but his own. And the conservatory? That was a world of polished prodigies, Juilliard-bound teenagers, professors who'd played at Carnegie Hall. They wouldn't want to hear a man in work boots play on their gleaming Steinway. But that night, as he sat at his old piano, his daughter, 16, bright-eyed and full of dreams, leaned against the doorframe. "You should do it," she said softly. He looked up, surprised. "Do what?" "The audition. At the conservatory." He shook his head, chuckling nervously. "Don't be silly. They're looking for real talent, not me." She stepped into the room and sat beside him on the bench. "Dad, I've heard you play since I was 5. You don't just play notes. You tell stories. That's real talent." He didn't answer right away. He pressed a single key, G above middle C, and let the note hang in the air. "People will laugh," he said quietly. "Maybe," she admitted. "But what if they don't? What if they hear what I hear? He looked at her, really looked. Saw the pride in her eyes, the quiet certainty. She believed in him more than he believed in himself. And that, more than anything, made him consider it. Over the next few days, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He'd be wiping down a piano after a student's lesson and imagine himself sitting there, under the spotlight, fingers trembling over the keys. He'd hear laughter in his head. Not cruel, just the kind of polite, dismissive chuckle people give when someone steps far outside their lane. But then he'd remember his daughter's voice. "You tell stories." One rainy Tuesday during his lunch break, he walked to the administration office. His palms were sweaty. His work shirt clung to his back. He stood outside the door for nearly 5 minutes, rehearsing what to say. Finally, he knocked. A young woman with glasses and a clipboard answered. "Can I help you? I saw the flyer," he said, voice low. "About the talent showcase," she smiled. "Oh, great. We'd love to have you. Do you sing? Play an instrument?" "I play piano," he said, barely above a whisper. "Wonderful. Just sign here." She handed him a clipboard. He hesitated. I'm not a student. I work here, custodian." Her smile didn't fade. "That's exactly who we want. The showcase is for staff and community members, too. Everyone's welcome." He signed his name with a shaky hand. As he walked back to his cart, he felt like he'd just jumped off a cliff. No turning back now. The audition was in 3 weeks. He had no idea what to play. He considered something simple, a folk tune, maybe a hymn, safe, unassuming. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't be enough. If he was going to step onto that stage, he wanted to play something that meant something, something that carried the weight of all those lonely nights, all those years of listening from the hallway. He settled on Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu. It was ambitious, fast, complex, full of emotion. He'd heard a student play it once, and it had haunted him for weeks. He'd spent months trying to figure it out by ear, slowing it down in his mind, replaying phrases over and over until his fingers could mimic the cascade of notes. It wasn't perfect. There were parts he still fumbled. But it was the piece that made his heart race, that made him feel alive. Every night after work, he practiced. Not just the notes, but the feeling behind them. He imagined the music as a storm, building, breaking, calming. He played until his fingers ached, until his neighbor pounded on the ceiling, until his daughter brought him tea and sat quietly in the corner, listening like it was the most important thing in the world. The days crept closer. He started having dreams. Sometimes he played flawlessly and the crowd rose to their feet. Other times his hands froze. The keys turned to stone and everyone laughed. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding. At work, he kept his head down. No one knew he'd signed up. He didn't want the whispers, the sideways glances. But the flyer was still up, and every time he passed it, his stomach twisted. The night before the audition, he couldn't sleep. He sat at the piano in the dark, playing softly so as not to wake his daughter. He ran through the piece slowly, carefully, breathing through the hard parts. When he finished, he rested his hands on the keys and whispered, "Just let me get through it." That's all. Morning came too soon. He put on his cleanest work shirt, still faded, still bearing the faint scent of floor wax, and tucked the handwritten notes for his piece into his pocket. He didn't own a suit, didn't have fancy shoes. All he had was this moment, this chance, and the music inside him. As he walked toward the conservatory, the city buzzed around him, honking cabs, chattering pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren. But inside everything was quiet, focused, ready. He didn't know it yet, but today would change everything. Not because he'd become famous or win a prize, but because for the first time, he was stepping out of the shadows and into the light, not as a custodian, but as someone who had something beautiful to share. And though fear clung to him like a second skin, there was something else beneath it. Something small but unshakable. Hope. He took a deep breath, pushed open the heavy oak doors of the conservatory, and walked in. The conservatory's main audition hall sat at the end of a long corridor lined with portraits of famous composers. Beethoven scowling, Chopin looking dreamy, Tchaikovsky with his intense eyes. James had walked past them 100 times while pushing his mop bucket, never imagining he'd one day walk down that same hallway as someone who belonged there. But today he did. His name was on the list. His time slot was 11:30 a.m. And now, standing just outside the heavy double doors, he could hear the muffled sounds of a violin soaring through a Vivaldi concerto. He checked his watch. 11:15, 15 minutes to go. His stomach twisted like a wrung-out rag. He leaned against the cool marble wall and tried to breathe slowly, but his chest felt tight. He glanced down at his hands, rough from years of scrubbing floors, nails short and practical. A small scar across his knuckle from a long-ago accident with a broken bottle. These weren't the hands of a concert pianist. They were the hands of a man who fixed leaky faucets and unclogged drains. What was he doing here? Inside the waiting room just off the hall, a dozen or so people sat on plush velvet chairs. Most were young, early 20s, maybe younger, dressed in crisp black slacks, tailored blazers, or elegant dresses. Some warmed up on silent keyboards they'd brought, fingers dancing in the air. Others whispered in hushed, serious tones about tempo and phrasing. A girl with her hair in a tight bun practiced finger exercises under her breath, eyes closed, completely absorbed. James hovered near the doorway, unsure whether to enter. He still wore his work shirt, clean but unmistakably a uniform, and his boots left faint scuff marks on the polished floor. He felt like he'd walked into the wrong movie. One of the young men looked up, saw him, and did a double take. Then he nudged his friend and nodded subtly in James's direction. A quiet ripple went through the room. Not loud, not mean, just the kind of look people give when something doesn't quite fit. James kept his eyes down and shuffled to the farthest chair near a potted fern. He sat, hands folded tightly in his lap. He could feel their glances, curious, confused, maybe even amused. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the chair and vanish before his name was called. A woman in a sleek gray suit entered, clipboard in hand. She had sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. This was the casting director, the one running the showcase. James had seen her around the conservatory before, always striding through the halls with purpose, students stepping aside like she was royalty. He'd heard she used to be a concert pianist herself decades ago, before an injury ended her performing career. Now she taught master classes and judged competitions. Her standards were legendary and unforgiving. She glanced at her list, then scanned the room. Her eyes landed on James for just a second, long enough for him to feel the weight of her assessment, and then moved on. She called the next name, a young woman with a cello case. The girl stood gracefully, gave a small nod, and followed the director into the audition hall. The doors closed behind them. James exhaled. He pulled the folded sheet of paper from his pocket, the one with the title of his piece scribbled in his own handwriting, Fantaisie Impromptu, Chopin. He hadn't written out the notes. He didn't need to, but having the title in his hand made it feel real. Like a promise. Minutes ticked by. A flutist played next, clear, bright notes floating through the door. Then a singer, voice trembling slightly but full of heart. Each performer came out looking either relieved or devastated. Some smiled. Others blinked back tears. James watched them all, heart pounding harder with every exit. Then it was his turn. The director opened the door and glanced at her list. "James Carter," she said, voice neutral. He stood so fast he nearly knocked over the potted fern. "Yes, that's me." She looked at him, really looked this time. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise? Doubt? He couldn't tell. "Come in," she said simply. He walked into the hall, boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The space was vast. High ceilings, red velvet curtains, a single grand piano centered on a raised platform. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust in the air like floating stars. It was beautiful and terrifying. A small panel of 3 sat at a table near the front, 2 faculty members and the director, who now took her seat in the middle. She placed her clipboard down and picked up a pen. "What will you be playing?" she asked. "Chopin," he said, voice quieter than he'd hoped. He cleared his throat. "The Fantaisie Impromptu." One of the faculty members raised an eyebrow. The other exchanged a glance with the director. The piece was notoriously difficult, fast, intricate, emotionally layered. Not something you casually pick up without years of training. The director gave a small nod. "Whenever you're ready." James walked to the piano. It was a Steinway, black, gleaming, perfect. He'd cleaned this very instrument just 2 days ago, polishing its surface until it shone like a mirror. Now he was supposed to play it. His palms were slick with sweat. He wiped them on his pants, took a deep breath, and sat on the bench. The moment he lowered himself onto the seat, a soft chuckle came from the doorway. He turned slightly. A few latecomers had gathered just outside, students who'd come to watch the auditions. One of them, a boy in a turtleneck, smirked and whispered something to his friend. Another covered her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. They weren't being cruel, just honest. To them, this was absurd. A custodian? Playing Chopin? On that piano? The laughter was quiet, but it cut deep. James felt his face burn. His fingers hovered over the keys, frozen. All those nights of practice, all that hope, it suddenly felt foolish, stupid. Who did he think he was? He glanced at the director. She was watching him, pen poised, expression unreadable. Waiting. Not unkindly, but not encouragingly either. Just waiting. He closed his eyes. And in that darkness, he heard his daughter's voice again. You tell stories. He thought of his mother's hands on their old piano. The way music used to fill their tiny apartment like a warm blanket on a cold night. He thought of all those years listening through practice room doors, dreaming in silence. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about proving he belonged. It was about sharing something true. He opened his eyes, placed his hands on the keys, and began. The first notes were soft, tentative, almost shy. A simple C-sharp minor chord held just a beat too long. Then came the left hand, rolling gently beneath like waves before a storm. The right hand entered with a cascade of 16th notes, fast, but not rushed, clear, intentional. The chuckling at the door stopped. The director's pen lowered. The room, which had felt so large and empty, suddenly seemed to shrink around him, holding its breath. James didn't think about technique. He didn't worry about hitting every note perfectly. He let the music move through him like a current. He played the opening section not as a display of speed, but as a question, aching, searching. When the tempo picked up, his fingers flew, but not mechanically. There was weight behind each note, a story in every phrase. He leaned into the dissonances, let the harmonies ache, then resolved them like sighs of relief. He'd never played for an audience before. But somehow it didn't feel like he was playing for them. It felt like he was playing through them, like the music needed to pass through this room, through these people, to exist fully. Halfway through, he forgot where he was. Forgot the director, the students, his work boots, his fear. There was only the piano, the notes, and the decades of silence he was finally breaking. Outside, the hallway had gone completely quiet. The students who'd been whispering now stood frozen, eyes wide. One girl clutched her sheet music to her chest like a shield. The boy who'd laughed earlier looked stunned, mouth slightly open. Inside the hall, one of the faculty members leaned forward in his chair. The other had set down her coffee and was staring at James like she'd never seen anything quite like this. The director hadn't moved. Her pen lay forgotten on the table. Her eyes were fixed on his hands, on the way they moved with a kind of weathered grace, like old trees bending in the wind but never breaking. James reached the climax of the piece, the swirling, thunderous middle section where both hands race in opposite directions. Most pianists play it with clinical precision, but James played it like it was tearing itself out of him, urgent, desperate, alive. The piano seemed to roar in response, its rich tones filling every corner of the room, and then just as suddenly it softened. The storm passed. The final section returned to the quiet longing of the beginning, now tinged with wisdom, with sorrow, with something like peace. He played the last chord, soft, lingering, and let it fade into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then from the back of the hall, a single voice whispered, "Wow." It was so quiet, James almost didn't hear it. But it broke the spell. The director slowly lowered her hands from where they'd been resting on the table. She didn't clap. She didn't smile. But her eyes, sharp, guarded eyes that had seen thousands of auditions, were glistening. She cleared her throat. "Thank you," she said, voice softer than before. "That was unexpected." James nodded, throat too tight to speak. He stood, legs shaky, and walked back to the door. As he passed the students in the hallway, they parted like a curtain. No one laughed now. No one smirked. They just watched him go, faces full of something he couldn't name. Respect? Wonder? Maybe just the quiet shock of having your assumptions shattered. He didn't go back to the waiting room. He walked straight out of the conservatory into the late morning sun. The city noise rushed back, the honking, the chatter, the rumble of buses, but it felt different now. Lighter. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he'd made the showcase or if anyone would remember his name. But for the first time in his life, he'd been seen, not as the man who cleaned the floors, but as someone who carried music inside him, like a secret flame. And that, he realized as he walked home with his head a little higher, was enough. The days after the audition moved strangely, like time had slowed down and sped up all at once. James went back to his routine. Wake up before dawn, make coffee, kiss his daughter on the forehead before she left for school, then walk to the conservatory with his mop and bucket like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Or maybe nothing had, except the way people looked at him. At first, he thought he'd imagined it. A student would pass him in the hallway, and instead of glancing away or giving a quick nod, they'd stop, smile, and say, "Hey, how's it going?" Not the polite, distant greeting he was used to, but something warmer, like they actually saw him. One afternoon, a young woman practicing in room 4 left her door open just a crack as he mopped nearby. When he paused to empty the trash, she called out, "That Chopin piece you played? I've been trying to learn it for months. How'd you get the left hand to flow like that?" He just shrugged and said, "I don't know, I just feel it." But she'd nodded like that made perfect sense. Then came the whispers, not the kind that mocked, but the kind that carried awe. "That's him, the custodian who played Chopin like a ghost from the past. I heard he never had a single lesson. He made Ms. Whitmore cry." He didn't know if that last one was true, but it spread like wildfire anyway. He tried to ignore it. He kept his head down, focused on his work. But it was hard when every time he entered a practice room to clean, students would fall silent mid-scale, watching him like he might burst into song right there on the spot. Once, a boy even asked for his autograph. James had laughed nervously and said, "Son, I sign time cards, not sheet music." Still, something inside him had shifted. That performance, those 4 minutes at the piano, had cracked open a door he didn't even know was locked. And now, light was pouring through. A week after the audition, he got a call during his lunch break. It was the conservatory's front office. The director wanted to see him. His stomach dropped. Had he done something wrong? Was this about the showcase? Maybe they'd decided it was a mistake to let him audition. Maybe they were going to ask him not to come back. He walked to her office with lead in his shoes. The door was open. She sat behind a large oak desk, sunlight catching the silver in her hair. She looked up when he entered, and for the first time she smiled. Not a polite professional smile, but a real one, warm and quiet. "Come in, James," she said. "Close the door." He did, heart hammering. She gestured to a chair. "Sit, please." He sat, hands folded tightly in his lap. "I've been thinking about your audition," she began, voice calm. "A lot." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "You played Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu," she said. "Not just played it, you inhabited it. Like you'd lived inside that music your whole life." He looked down. "I've listened to it for years. Tried to figure it out by ear." "No teacher?" "Never." She was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Do you know how rare that is? Not just the skill, but the honesty. Most students play to impress. You played to tell the truth." He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. She opened a folder on her desk. "The showcase is in 2 weeks. We've made our selections." She paused. "You're in." Relief washed over him so strong he almost slumped in his chair. But before he could thank her, she continued, "But that's not why I called you here." He looked up. "I've been at this conservatory for 23 years, she said. "I've heard thousands of auditions. Talented kids, disciplined prodigies, perfect technique. But very few play like they've got something to say. You do." She stood and walked to the window, arms crossed. "Music isn't just notes on a page. It's memory. It's pain. It's joy you can't put into words. And you gave us all a reminder of that." She turned back to him. "I'd like to offer you something. Not just a spot in the showcase, but a role here. A new kind of role." He blinked. "I don't understand." "We're starting a community mentorship program," she explained. "For self-taught musicians, for people outside the traditional path. People who found music in kitchens, in churches, in subway stations. We want them to come here, to share their stories, their methods, their love of sound. And we want someone to lead those sessions, someone who's walked that road." She looked at him directly. "I'd like you to be that person." James stared at her. "Me, but I'm not a teacher. I don't know theory.
I can't explain why I do what I do. That's exactly why it has to be you, she said gently.
Because you don't teach rules. You teach feeling, and that's what these students are missing. He sat in silence for a long time. The offer hung in the air like a held note. It was more than he'd ever dreamed of. But it also scared him. Teaching in this place, where he'd spent years invisible. What about my custodial job? He finally asked. You can keep it, she said without hesitation. We'll adjust your schedule. Part-time cleaning, part-time mentoring. You'll be paid for both, he swallowed. I'd need to think about it. Of course, she said. Take the weekend. He left her office in a daze. The rest of the day passed in a blur. He mopped floors, emptied bins, wiped down pianos, but his mind was somewhere else. Somewhere between fear and wonder. That night, he told his daughter. She nearly jumped out of her chair. Dad, that's incredible. You have to say yes. But what if I'm not good at it? He asked, stirring his coffee. What if I let them down? You won't, she said firmly. You already showed them what real music sounds like. Now you get to show them how it's made. He thought about it all weekend. He played his old piano late into the night, not practicing for the showcase, just playing. Letting his hands remember why they'd started in the first place. And slowly the fear began to soften, not disappear, but make room for something else. Purpose. On Monday morning, he went back to the conservatory early. He found the director before her first class. I'll do it, he said simply. She smiled again, that same quiet, real smile. Good. The next 2 weeks flew by. Rehearsals for the showcase were scheduled in the main hall after hours. James came in when the building was empty, just him and the grand piano under the soft glow of stage lights. He practiced every day, not to perfect the piece, but to deepen it. He listened to recordings of famous pianists playing the Fantaisie Impromptu, not to copy them, but to understand how many ways one piece of music could live. He also met with the director to plan his first mentorship session. They decided to call it Music from the Heart. He'd talk about how he learned by listening, how he used emotion as his guide, how mistakes weren't failures but part of the story. He'd even bring his old upright piano from home for students to try, its imperfections a lesson in themselves. The night before the showcase, the conservatory buzzed with energy. Posters lined the halls. Students rehearsed in every corner. James kept to himself, doing his usual rounds, but now people greeted him by name. Good luck tomorrow. Can't wait to hear you again. He nodded, thanked them, but inside the old nerves were creeping back. What if he froze? What if his hands betrayed him in front of a full house? What if this was all just a fluke? A moment of magic that couldn't be repeated. His daughter came to the conservatory that evening, carrying a small paper bag. I brought you something, she said, handing it to him. Inside was a new pair of black dress shoes, polished, simple, elegant. You don't have to wear your work boots on stage, she said softly. He looked at them, then at her. You didn't have to do this. I wanted to, she said. You've spent your whole life making things clean and beautiful for other people. Tonight it's your turn. He hugged her tight. The day of the showcase arrived. The hall was packed, students, faculty, parents, even a few local news reporters who'd heard rumors about the janitor who stunned the judges. Backstage, James sat on a folding chair wearing his best slacks, a plain white shirt and those new shoes. His hands rested in his lap, steady now. One by one, performers took the stage, a violinist, a soprano, a jazz trio. Each received warm applause. Then the director stepped to the microphone. Our final performer tonight, she said, is someone many of you already know. He's been part of this building for over a decade, not as a student, but as someone who kept its halls clean, its pianos dusted, its spirit humble. But last month he reminded us all that music doesn't care about titles. It only cares about truth. She paused. Please welcome James Carter. The curtain parted. The spotlight found him as he walked to the piano. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, but this time he didn't look down. He looked out, saw his daughter in the third row, beaming. Saw students who once ignored him now leaning forward in their seats. Saw the director standing in the wings, arms crossed, waiting. He sat, placed his hands on the keys, took one deep breath and played. This time there was no hesitation. No fear, just music, pure, honest, alive. He played the Fantaisie Impromptu not as a challenge to conquer, but as a gift to give. Every note carried the weight of his journey. The loneliness, the listening, the love, the late nights in a basement with a broken piano. When he finished, The silence was deeper than before. Then applause. Not polite, not cautious, thunderous. People stood. Some wiped tears. A few students clapped so hard their hands turned red. He stood, bowed slightly, and walked off stage. But he didn't go to the green room. He went straight to the custodial closet, changed back into his work shirt, and picked up his mop. Because the floors still needed cleaning, but as he pushed his cart down the hall that night, students stopped to thank him. Not for cleaning, for playing, for showing them that music belongs to everyone. And for the first time, James didn't feel like an outsider in this grand house of sound. He felt like he'd finally come home. The morning after the showcase, James woke up to something he hadn't expected. Quiet. Not the usual quiet of his basement apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of the subway, but a different kind of silence. The kind that comes after something big has happened, and the world is still catching its breath. He made coffee like always, the steam curling in the early light. His daughter was already up, scrolling through her phone with wide eyes. "Dad," she said without looking up, "you're on the internet." He chuckled. "What do you mean?" She turned the screen toward him. There it was, a video titled "Custodian Stuns Conservatory with Chopin Performance." It had been posted by a student who'd recorded the showcase on their phone. In just 12 hours, it had over 200,000 views. Comments poured in. "This gave me chills. Real talent doesn't need a degree. I cried. I don't even like classical music." James stared at the screen, stunned. He wasn't used to being seen, let alone watched by strangers across the world. He felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort, like someone had opened a window into his private life without asking. By noon, his phone started ringing. Local news stations wanted interviews. A radio show asked him to come on live. A music magazine requested a feature. He politely declined most of them. He wasn't looking for fame. He never had been. All he'd ever wanted was to play, and maybe, just maybe, be heard. But the attention didn't stop at his door. At the conservatory, everything had shifted. Students who used to rush past him now lingered, asking questions. "How do you learn by ear? Do you ever get nervous? Can you show me that left-hand run?" Even professors nodded at him in the hallways with a new kind of respect. Not pity, not curiosity, but genuine admiration. The director, Ms. Whitmore, called him into her office again a few days later. She looked tired but happy. "The video's gone viral," she said, sliding a laptop toward him. "We've had over 1,000 emails from people wanting to join the mentorship program. Some are retired teachers. Others are street musicians. One man plays accordion in the subway tunnels. They all say the same thing. If he can do it, maybe I can too." James didn't know what to say. He'd never thought his story could mean something to strangers. "We're expanding the program," she continued. "Starting next month, we'll host monthly community nights. Open to anyone. No auditions, no fees. Just music shared honestly." She looked at him. "And I need you to lead it." He hesitated. "I'm not a speaker. I don't know how to run a program." "You don't have to run it like a class," she said gently. "Just be yourself, play, talk a little. Let others play. That's enough." He thought about it. Then he nodded. "Okay." Preparations began right away. They cleared out a smaller recital room, warmer, more intimate, and set up chairs in a circle instead of rows. James brought his old upright piano from the basement. It looked out of place next to the conservatory's gleaming grands, but that was the point. This wasn't about perfection. It was about heart. The night of the first community gathering, James arrived early. He tuned the piano as best he could, wiped down the bench, and arranged a few folding chairs. He wore his usual work shirt, not to hide, but because it was who he was. He didn't need a suit to belong here. One by one, people arrived. A woman in her 60s with a guitar case covered in stickers, a teenager carrying a beat-up trumpet, an older man with a harmonica in his pocket. Some came from nearby neighborhoods. Others had taken trains from hours away. They were nervous, unsure, glancing around like they didn't belong. James greeted each one at the door. "Welcome," he'd say, shaking their hand or offering a smile. "Glad you're here." When the room was full, about 30 people, he stood in the center, hands in his pockets. "No podium, no script. I'm not going to give a speech," he began. Voice quiet but steady. "I'm just like you. I didn't go to music school. I learned by listening, by trying, by messing up 1,000 times. And I kept going because the music wouldn't let me stop. He sat at his old piano. So tonight, we're not here to impress. We're here to share. If you want to play, play. If you just want to listen, that's fine too. No judgment. Just music. He played a short piece, something simple, warm, like a lullaby. Not Chopin this time, but a melody he'd made up years ago, inspired by rain on his fire escape. When he finished, the room was still. Then the woman with the guitar stood. "I'll go next," she said, voice trembling. She played a folk song her grandmother had taught her, fingers clumsy but full of love. When she finished, people clapped, not out of politeness but because they felt it. The teenager played a jazz riff he'd written in his bedroom. The older man played a blues harmonica tune that made everyone tap their feet. A young girl, no older than 10, sang a hymn in a voice so clear it made James's eyes water. No one was perfect. Notes were missed. Chords were wrong. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the courage it took to stand up and share something real. Afterward, people stayed late, talking, laughing, swapping stories. One man told James he'd stopped playing after his wife passed away 10 years ago. "Hearing you tonight, I think I'll pick up my sax again," he said, voice thick. James just nodded. "Music waits," he said. "It always does." Word of the gathering spread. More people came each month. Some brought instruments. Others just brought their ears and their hearts. Students from the conservatory started attending too, not to perform, but to listen. To learn that music wasn't just about technique, but about truth. One evening, Ms. Whitmore sat in the back watching quietly. Afterward, she walked up to James. "You've changed this place," she said. He shook his head. "I just opened a door." They walked through it, she smiled. Sometimes that's the hardest part. Back at home, life didn't change much on the surface. James still woke early, still made coffee, still went to work. But now, when he mopped the practice rooms, students would ask him to listen to their pieces, not for critique, but for feeling. "Does this sound like joy?" one asked. "Or just noise?" He'd sit on the edge of the bench, close his eyes, and say, "It sounds like you're trying to please your teacher. Try playing like you're talking to your best friend." They'd try again, and this time it would be different. His daughter started piano lessons, not at the conservatory, but at a small community center. "I don't want to be perfect," she told him. "I want to play like you." He helped her practice at night, not with drills or scales, but with songs she loved. Pop tunes, movie themes, old spirituals. "Find the story in it," he'd say. "Then tell it." One Saturday, a reporter from a national newspaper came to the conservatory. She wanted to write a profile. James agreed, but only if she also talked to the other community musicians, the woman with the guitar, the harmonica player, the teenager with the trumpet. "It's not just my story," he told her. "It's ours." The article came out a week later. The headline read, "The Piano in the Basement, How One Man Reminded a Music School What Really Matters." It wasn't just about James. It was about the gatherings, the shared songs, the return of music as a human act, not a competition. Still, James didn't let it go to his head. He turned down offers to perform at fancy venues, said no to record labels. "I'm not a performer," he'd say. "I'm a listener who learned to play." But he did accept one invitation to play at a local nursing home. The residents, many of them former musicians themselves, sat in wheelchairs and armchairs, eyes closed, hands tapping softly on their laps as he played. Afterward, an elderly woman took his hand. "You played like my husband used to," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him back to me, even for a minute." That meant more to him than any headline. At the conservatory, things kept evolving. The mentorship program became a permanent part of the curriculum. New students were required to attend at least one community night during their first year. "To remember why you started," the syllabus read. James still cleaned the floors, still emptied the trash. But now, when he walked down the hall, students didn't just see a custodian. They saw someone who carried music in his bones. And in seeing him, they began to see themselves differently too. Not as future stars, but as storytellers with something to share. One rainy afternoon, as he wiped down a grand piano after a lesson, a first-year student lingered. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. Do you ever wish you'd started earlier? Like when you were a kid? With real lessons?" He thought for a moment. "No," he said finally. "Because if I had, I might have learned to play correctly, but I might have forgotten how to play honestly. All those years listening from the hallway that taught me to hear the soul in the music. And that's worth more than perfect fingers. She nodded slowly, like she was storing that away for later. That night, as he walked home under his umbrella, the city lights reflecting in puddles, James felt a deep kind of peace. He hadn't changed the world, but he'd changed a room, a hallway, a few hearts, and sometimes that was enough. Because music wasn't about stages or spotlights, it was about connection. And in that he'd found his true place, not in the background, but right in the middle of the song. A year had passed since the day James sat down at the grand piano in the conservatory's audition hall, the day they laughed, then fell silent. Now, as autumn leaves swirled outside the tall windows of the same building, he stood in a different room, not as a nervous custodian, but as a quiet anchor in a space that had finally learned to listen. The community mentorship program, now called Open Keys, had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a monthly gathering in a small recital room had become a weekly event, often spilling into the main hall when too many people showed up. Musicians came from all over the city. Subway performers, church choir directors, retired teachers, teenagers with beat-up guitars, even a man who played spoons and harmonica together like it was symphony. And every time James was there, not at the center, but nearby, ready to play, ready to listen, ready to remind everyone that music wasn't about perfection, but about presence. He still wore his work uniform most days, still pushed his mop bucket down the same marble halls. But now students didn't just say hello, they asked him questions. How do you stay calm when you play? What do you do when you mess up? Can you hear the music in your head before you play it? He answered simply, honestly, never pretending to be more than he was. And that honesty became his gift. The conservatory had changed too. Faculty meetings now included discussions about emotional authenticity alongside technical training. First-year students were required to attend at least 3 open keys sessions before they could declare a performance track. One professor even started ending her classes with 5 minutes of free play. No rules, no judgment, just sound from the heart. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was the point. One crisp Saturday morning, James arrived early to set up for the weekly gathering. He wheeled his old upright piano, now lovingly nicknamed Old Faithful by the regulars, into the room and tuned it as best he could. A few students were already there, arranging chairs in a circle. One of them, a shy girl who'd barely spoken during her first visit months ago, now greeted him with a wide smile. I wrote something new, she said, clutching a notebook. I think I'll play it today. That's great, James said. Just remember, play it like you mean it, not like you're proving something. She nodded, took a deep breath, and went to find a seat. As more people arrived, the room filled with the soft hum of tuning instruments, quiet laughter, and the clink of coffee mugs. No one rushed. No one performed for likes or grades. They were just there, to share, to heal, to remember why they fell in love with sound in the first place. James didn't always play during these sessions. Sometimes he just sat and listened, eyes closed, letting the music wash over him like a warm tide. But when he did play, it was never flashy. Just a simple melody, maybe a gospel tune his mother used to hum, or a quiet improvisation inspired by the rain outside. And every time the room grew still, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Later that afternoon, after the last note had faded and people began packing up, Ms. Whitmore found him in the hallway, wiping down a practice room door. She looked tired but content. They're talking about making Open Keys a national model, she said, leaning against the wall. Other conservatories want to start their own versions. James paused, rag in hand. That's good. You know this started with you, right? She said gently. Not just your playing, your way of being. You showed us that music isn't owned by institutions. It belongs to anyone who dares to feel it. He looked down at his worn boots. I just played what was in me. And that, she said, is the rarest thing of all. A few days later, the conservatory held its annual donor gala, a fancy affair with tuxedos, champagne, and speeches. James had never attended before. He wasn't invited. But this year, Ms. Whitmore insisted. You're part of this story now, she told him. They need to see you. He didn't own a suit, so his daughter took him shopping. They found a simple navy blazer at a second-hand store, paired it with dark slacks and his now well-worn dress shoes. He felt strange in it, like he was wearing someone else's skin, but his daughter squeezed his arm and said, "You look like you belong." At the gala, he stood near the back holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the crowd mingle. Wealthy donors, famous alumni, city officials, all dressed in finery, speaking in polished tones. He felt out of place again, the old fear creeping in. Then Ms. Whitmore took the stage. She spoke about the conservatory's mission, its history, its future, and then she said, "This year we've relearned something essential, that music isn't just about excellence. It's about humanity, and no one has reminded us of that more powerfully than someone who's walked these halls not for applause but for duty, and who gave us a gift we never expected." She turned and pointed to where James stood. "Please welcome James Carter." The room turned. For a heartbeat, he froze. Then slowly people began to stand. Not all at once, but steadily. First the students, then the faculty, then the donors. Soon the entire room was on its feet, clapping not out of politeness, but out of gratitude. Tears welled in his eyes. He didn't bow. He just nodded, hand over his heart. Afterward, people came up to him, not to ask for favors or take selfies, but to say thank you. A woman told him her grandson had started playing piano again after watching the viral video. A man said he'd brought his estranged brother to an open keys night, and they'd talked for the first time in years through music. James listened to each one, looked them in the eye and said, "Thank you for showing up." Later that night, walking home under a sky full of stars, he felt a deep quiet settle in his chest. Not the silence of being unseen, but the peace of being known. Life went on. He still cleaned, still played, still made coffee every morning and kissed his daughter goodbye before school. But now, when he passed the grand piano in the main hall, he sometimes sat for a minute, just to feel the keys beneath his fingers, to remember that moment when everything changed. One spring afternoon, a young boy, maybe 10 years old, approached him while he was emptying a trash bin in the lobby. The boy held a small keyboard under one arm. "Are you the piano man?" he asked, eyes wide. James smiled. "I guess I am. My mom showed me the video," the boy said. "You played Chopin. Like magic." "It wasn't magic," James said, kneeling so they were eye level. "It was just practice. And love." The boy frowned. "But you didn't go to music school." "No," James said. "But I listened. A lot. And I never stopped trying." The boy thought about that. Then he held out his keyboard. "Can you show me how to start?" James looked around. The lobby was quiet. Sunlight streamed through the windows. He set down his bucket, sat on the floor beside the boy, and placed his rough hands gently on the small plastic keys. "First," he said, "close your eyes. Listen to the silence. That's where the music begins, and right there, on the marble floor of the Grand Conservatory, the custodian and the child made their first notes together, not for an audience, not for a grade, but for the simple joy of sound. Weeks turned into months. The boy came back every Saturday, always with new questions, new songs he'd tried to figure out. James never called it teaching. He called it sharing. And in that sharing, something beautiful grew, not just in the boy, but in James too. He realized then that his story wasn't just about one performance. It was about what happened after, the ripples, the way one honest moment could open doors for others, the way a mop bucket and a piano could coexist in the same life, not as opposites, but as parts of a whole. One evening, as he locked up the conservatory for the night, he paused at the front steps. The city hummed around him, cars, voices, distant sirens, but inside he felt still. He looked up at the building that had once felt like a fortress of talent he could never enter. Now it felt like home. Not because he'd conquered it, but because he'd helped make space in it for everyone. He walked home slowly, hands in his pockets, whistling a tune only he knew. It wasn't Chopin. It wasn't famous. But it was his. And that was enough. Years later, long after his daughter had moved out and started her own life, long after the viral video had faded into internet history, people at the conservatory still told the story. They laughed when he sat down, then his piano stunner silenced the room. But the real story wasn't in the silence. It was in what came after. The music that kept playing, the voices that kept rising, the doors that stayed open. And every time a new student walked in, nervous and unsure, someone would point to the custodian mopping near the practice rooms and say, "Don't worry. If he can do it, so can you." Because in the end, music wasn't about who you were when you started. It was about what you were willing to share when you finally sat down and played. The story wasn't supposed to have a sixth part. 5 acts felt complete: beginning, struggle, breakthrough, impact, legacy. But life doesn't wrap itself in neat chapters. Sometimes the quietest moments after the applause hold the deepest truth. 2 years after that first audition, James still woke before sunrise, still made the same strong black coffee, still walked the same 10 blocks to the conservatory, boots scuffing the pavement in rhythm with his thoughts. But now, when he passed the grand entrance, he no longer felt like a guest in someone else's world. He belonged not because he'd been given a title or a spotlight, but because he'd shown up day after day, with honesty in his hands and music in his bones. The Open Keys program had become a permanent heartbeat of the conservatory. It wasn't just a side project anymore, it was woven into the school's identity. New students were told on their first day, "Before you learn to impress, learn to connect. Go to Open Keys, listen, play, be human." James still cleaned the floors, still wiped down the pianos. But now, when he entered a practice room, students didn't stop playing out of awkwardness. They'd often invite him to sit. "What do you hear in this passage?" one would ask. "Does it feel rushed?" another would wonder. He'd listen, close his eyes, and say something simple like, "It sounds like you're running from the silence. Try letting it breathe." And they would. And it would change everything. One rainy Tuesday, as he mopped the hallway near room 7, a familiar sound drifted out, a hesitant version of the Fantasy Impromptu. He paused. It was the same piece he'd played that day they laughed. But this time it was being played by a first-year student, fingers stumbling over the fast runs, frustration clear in every missed note. James knocked softly and stepped inside. The student, a young person with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, looked up embarrassed. "Sorry," they mumbled. "I know I'm butchering it." "You're not butchering it," James said gently. "You're wrestling with it. That's how it's supposed to feel." He walked over and sat on the bench beside them. "This piece isn't about speed. It's about longing, like you're reaching for something just out of sight." The student frowned. "But the recording I listened to, it's so clean, so perfect." "Perfect is lonely," James said. "Real is what moves people." He placed his hands on the keys, not to show off, but to guide. "Try it slower. Feel the spaces between the notes. Let the left hand sing, not just keep time." They tried again. This time it wasn't flawless, but it had heart. And when they finished, they looked at James with something new in their eyes, not shame but hope. "Thank you," they whispered. He nodded. "You're not learning to play Chopin. You're learning to speak through him. That takes time." As he left the room, he realized something. He wasn't just keeping the floors clean anymore. He was helping keep the music honest. Later that week, the conservatory announced a special event. Music Without Walls, a free outdoor concert in the park across the street, open to anyone. No tickets, no dress code, just sound shared under the sky. James was asked to open the show. He almost said no. Playing outside in daylight with strangers walking by, it felt too exposed. But then he remembered the boy with the keyboard, the woman who cried at the nursing home, the students who now played not to win but to feel. This wasn't about him. It was about keeping the door open, so he said yes. The day of the concert, the sky was clear, the air warm with the promise of spring. A small stage was set up on the grass with a single piano under a white canopy. Folding chairs were arranged in a loose semicircle, but most people stood or sat on blankets, kids running between them, dogs dozing in the sun. James arrived early, wearing his usual work shirt, clean, but unpressed, and his dress shoes now scuffed from use. He didn't bring sheet music. He didn't need it. As the crowd grew, he stayed backstage, breathing slowly, watching families arrive, grandparents with walkers, teenagers with earbuds dangling, toddlers clutching toy instruments. These weren't concert-goers. They were neighbors. And that made it matter more. When it was time, Miss Whitmore introduced him simply. A man who reminded us that music lives in everyone. He walked out to light applause, not thunderous, not reverent, just warm. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the sea of faces. No judgment. No expectations. Just people waiting to hear something true. He didn't play Chopin this time. Instead, he played a piece he'd written himself. Never named, never recorded. It began with a single low note like a heartbeat. Then a simple melody rose, gentle and searching, like someone walking through an old neighborhood remembering. It wasn't complex. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of late nights, of mopping floors while listening to dreams through thin walls, of a daughter's quiet faith, of a lifetime of showing up even when no one was watching. Halfway through, a child near the front stopped fidgeting and stared at the piano, eyes wide. An older man wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. A woman held her baby closer. When he finished, there was no standing ovation. Just a long, soft silence, then scattered claps that grew into something steady, heartfelt. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Afterward, people came up to him, not for autographs, but to share stories. That last part, it sounded like my childhood porch. I haven't heard piano like that since my father passed. My kid wants to learn now. Where do we start? He answered each one patiently. Start with what moves you, not what's hard, what's true. As the sun dipped below the trees, the next performers took the stage. A string quartet of conservatory students, then a community choir, then a jazz duo from the Bronx. James stayed to listen, sitting on the grass with a paper cup of lemonade, watching the music flow from one person to the next like a river. Later, walking back to the conservatory, Ms. Whitmore walked beside him. You could have played anywhere tonight, she said. Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center. But you chose the park, he smiled. Music doesn't belong behind velvet ropes. It belongs where people live, she nodded. You've changed more than this school, you know. You've changed how people think about who gets to make art. I didn't change anything, he said. I just refused to stay quiet. Back at home that night, his daughter called. She was away at college now studying social work, but she'd watched the live stream of the concert. You looked happy, she said. I was, he replied. Do you ever miss the old days, when no one knew your name? He thought about it. Sometimes. There was peace in being unseen. But there's purpose in being seen, and using that to lift others up. She was quiet for a moment. I'm proud of you, Dad. I'm proud of us, he said. Weeks passed. Life settled into its rhythm again. But something had shifted. Not in the world, but in the air. People talked differently about talent now, less about where you studied, more about why you play. At local schools, music teachers started open keys style sessions. A community center in Brooklyn launched a Music for All night inspired by James's story. He never sought credit. He just kept showing up. One afternoon, while cleaning the lobby, he found a small envelope taped to his mop bucket. Inside was a handwritten note and a photo. The note read, You played at the park last month. My son, who hasn't spoken since his accident 2 years ago, hummed your melody the next day. Thank you for giving him back his voice even for a moment. The photo showed a boy at a window, hands resting on a keyboard, sunlight on his face. James read the note 3 times. Then he tucked it into his lunch pail, right next to the thermos of coffee. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't need to. It was enough that it existed. That night he sat at his old upright piano and played the same melody from the park, softly, slowly, sending it out into the dark like a prayer. Years later, long after he'd retired from cleaning, long after the viral video had become a footnote in internet history, the conservatory unveiled a small plaque near the main entrance. It didn't say award-winning pianist or featured performer. It simply read, In honor of those who listen deeply, play honestly and remind us that music belongs to everyone. Beneath it, a single bench sat under a tree, where students, custodians, neighbors, and strangers could sit together, share a song, or just be quiet in the presence of something beautiful. James never saw the plaque. He didn't need to. He lived it. And every time someone sat down at a piano, whether in a grand hall or a basement apartment, whether their hands were smooth or calloused, they carried a little of his courage with them, because the real story wasn't about silencing a room with a stunning performance. It was about opening a door and leaving it wide open for everyone who came after.